Hello and welcome to Revolutionary Ideas, the Marxist podcast from Socialist Alternative. In this episode, we'll be interviewing two socialist and worker activists from Movement for a Socialist Alternative, which is ISA's section in Nigeria. We spoke in particular about the campaign for the freedom of Daniel Akande and all political prisoners who've been jailed by the regime of Bola Tinubu. To support our campaigns, follow the Nigeria Solidarity Campaign. On Facebook, we're called Nigeria Solidarity Campaign, and on Instagram, you can follow us at Nigeria Solidarity. With that said, let's get started with the episode. Okay, so I'm here currently at International Socialist Alternative's World Congress, which is taking place in Kiel, Germany. I'm currently joined by two of our members from ISA's section in Nigeria, the Movement for a Socialist Alternative. And we're talking in this episode, about the campaign to free Daniel Akande, a jailed worker and youth activist, and all political prisoners jailed by the Tinubu regime, but also what's the situation in Nigeria and what's the future for the Nigerian working class in the struggle for socialism. So the two comrades that I'm joined by here today are Dagger and Michael. How are you both?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's nice to be on this podcast and to bring the Nigerian situation to everybody out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, what's the current status of the campaign then, and what are the charges that Daniel's facing potentially?
Daniel was part of the Abuja Left Group, which was a coalition of left organizations in Abuja. And definitely this includes the Movement for Socialist Alternative, our own organization with other left organizations in Abuja. And at the point of going into that End Bad Governance protest, a national youth protest for that matter, as radical left organizations, we are very critical about the characters behind the call for that protest and what color will the protest itself, take from day one till the last day. And this was based on our experiences and lessons from the NSAS protest of 2020.
Yeah, which was a movement against police brutality, wasn't it?
Yes, exactly, which was a protest against police brutality. Because as ideological organizations, we also draw lessons from our experience and involvement in struggles all across board. And this brought us to that conclusion at that point in time that we need by ourselves to sit down and draw all possible characters and possibilities for that End Bad Governance protest of August. And in reacting to this, our comrades in Abuja, formed an alliance, and there was an Abuja Left Group, which was established primarily to provide the needed and necessary leadership for that protest,
which was a role that the leadership of the Nigerian unions were not playing.
Exactly.
Was the point,
Exactly. No, ordinarily we expect the trade and labor union movements to come in place and provide this leadership, for the protest of the Nigerian youth. They should. But following the bankruptcy in the trade and labor union in the country, our own comrades, put their life at stake in providing that leadership for the movement, for the protest of Nigerian youth in August. And it was primarily because of the role our comrades played in this protest that the federal government started to handpick comrades, arrest comrades across board, and this kind of arrests different characters itself, characters in the sense that an arrest being carried out in the middle of the night, an arrest being carried out in the church service process, an arrest being carried out with invasions into private properties of comrades. So these are the characterizations of that arrest. And moving away from this, it's also important for us to understand that what actually, could be the rationale, for the arrest of our comrades beyond just being providers of the leadership for that national youth protest in the country. The sitting governments in Nigeria today didn't enjoy the popularity to power during the 2023 general election, and it was on that basis that right from the genesis of the government, any radical dissenting voice against the government is being passionately being quenched by all state agencies and instrumentalities of the political class in the country.
Because they're afraid of what it can lead to as well, isn't it? The situation is ripe for
and
struggle.
And you could actually see this in the arrest of the NLC president while on his way for a conference, in London. You get now. And you could actually imagine what the charges of our comrades levied against them after the arrest: treason and felony. And
which are charges that that could carry the death penalty.
Yeah, definitely the death penalty charges.
And that is a country that has had a history of military regimes or attempted coup d'etats, and these soldiers were arrested, tried and executed on the charges of treason felony. The Tinubu regime is not a military regime. It's not even a military dictatorship. It claims that it is grounded on a bourgeois democracy, on a bourgeois constitution, the 1999 constitution, which recognizes freedom of association, freedom of movement, and within that context, the right of people to protest, and disagree with institutions, with individuals, and as well as government. To now have our comrades or Nigerians going to the streets to protest against government's policies. Government policies that are not original to Nigeria, but crafted by the IMF and World Bank, and through the Tinubu regime imposed on the Nigerian economy, which has resulted, from everything that we have said, to huge hunger, mass unemployment on the street, to have people organize themselves to protest against hunger in the land. These people are arrested, are rounded up, like he has pointed out. Protests in Abuja, Lagos held peacefully. Protests in Abuja too held with no violence. The violence you had in Abuja was orchestrated by the police. Of course, in the northern part of the country, places like Kano, Kaduna, Sokoto, the protests, the hunger protests, and protests against to end bad governance, was more agitative. You saw people pulling buildings down. There can be no way by which you could say yes to this manner of protest, but it explains the huge anger and frustration. They were not just pulling any building down; they were pulling down buildings and symbols. The party headquarters that symbolized the party the president comes from. It's another means of these working class youths in the north expressing their frustration and anger at the neoliberal policies of deregulation and privatization being implemented by the Tinubu regime. Again, too, in the north, you had people, holding on to Russian flag.
Which was the thing I was going to ask you about. The presence of illusions in the idea that Russian imperialism can be a progressive force.
The point to make is to understand the level of consciousness of those people who are wielding those flags, and not use that to justify, because the government has come to court and is pushing that as an evidence, to accuse these people, of treason. The point we should say is that nearly all members of the billionaire club in Nigeria, including Tinubu himself, who own properties, who hold hotel properties and run hotel businesses, have dozens of flags from various countries flying, in their premises. Not just there, you also have a lot of churches that flies flags of the US, of various foreign countries. So if people are being brought to court on the basis that they are wielding a flag, a foreign flag during the protest, nearly all members of billionaire club, including Mr. President himself, who owns hotel.
Is he a billionaire himself?
Yes. Yes. If he doesn't own hotel facilities directly, his proteges, all hotels, they have all of these foreign flags. It means that all of these billionaires must also be brought on trial. But they are not going to do this. But more clearly or more scientifically, for these ordinary people, that flag for them was a complete rejection of the policies of the Tinubu regime. Of course, we wouldn't join the working class youths in the north, to put forward the Russian flag. But this Russian flag is emanating from the fact that the northern states share the same borders, not just with Niger Republic, and other countries like Mali and Burkina Faso where military coups have occurred, where regimes in those places are sort of sympathetic to Russian imperialism, and the kind of support they think they are getting from the Russian state to combat terrorism, to combat the scourge of Islamic fundamentalist terror groups. And of course, in the north, they suffer this Islamic terrorist group more than any other sections of the country. The Boko Haram is based there. For them, they think that if U.S. imperialism and the whole of the Western Bloc are not providing the necessary support for the regime to take on these terrorists on their behalf, the Russian flag, becomes the necessary symbol. Of course, tied to that is the question of a call, for a military coup by these working class youth protesters. But we must say that,
which is a slogan we would not raise.
Yes. We want to say that all of the 11 comrades in Abuja that were arrested and placed on trial, with the Russian flag brought as evidence against them, were not involved in all of those protests. But we also will not directly condemn the working class youths who came to the protest holding that flag and were opposed to that being criminalized.
It's an expression of desperation to an extent, isn't it?
We wouldn't share illusions with them, but we will support and defend them as against the government's position that to wield a Russian flag in a protest is wrong. We will say if any law in the country says that to hold a flag, a foreign flag in Nigeria is a crime, all members of the billionaire club, including Mr. President, are as guilty, and the law. But I think more importantly, is the fear the regime has, which is why it has arrested these 11 persons, commenced a treason trial. It didn't stop there. Hundreds of working class youths in the north were also arrested. And we saw what happened November 1 when 76 of these minors were brought into court. And 76 of these minors were brought into court. And the huge scandal that was created for the Tinubu regime and the entirety of the ruling class in the country. How do you bring 8 years old, 9 years old, 13 years old children into court for having gone out on the street to join a protest? You kidnap them away from their parents for 3 months.
Because of the policies of that same regime as well.
Their parents didn't know their whereabouts for 3 months. They were in detention for over 93 days. And after 93 days, you bring them to court, tattered, hungered, no food. And it raises, and the ruling class will be warned. Because if they continue in this trajectory, they themselves are going to be the prisoners and will have to be made to suffer these same conditions. If the mass of the working people in Nigeria gets organized, take over political power, the possibility that they themselves will be prisoners tomorrow. And which is why the question of the necessary prison reforms. On the basis of your laws, if people are arrested, tried, and imprisoned, they become citizens. They have not been sentenced to death. The state must naturally, as expected, take care of their feedings, take care of their clothing. To have children between the age of 7 and 13 in prison for 30 days. Government not bothered about how they will feed all of this period and bringing them publicly to trial as if these people had been forced to live in a famished land. The same charges with which Daniel was accused and the other 10 Abuja activists was the same charges that was slammed on all of these children. For engaging in protests, for calling for a coup, for holding the Russian flag. So they were also charged of the same accused. But what has happened? The state and the Tinubu regime became scandalized over the publicity around this event. And hurriedly, Mr. President, announced a presidential pardon, for all of these 76 children who have now been released. But they didn't end there.
And that was under pressure, was it?
Yes.
Yeah, pressure of the masses. Yeah.
And it is not unconnected. Of course, the 11 people still remain, while we've all worked, Nigerians, and both solidarity from inside and outside all over the world, has provided the necessary support and pressure, to ensure that all of the 11 people that were detained and brought to trial, have finally been granted bail. But the trial proper will still commence. The last adjourned date when the trial was to begin was November 8th. Painfully, they announced that the judge was on vacation. We still have our heads on the ground to see when this new date will be announced.
Yeah,
but we are using this podcast, as an opportunity to appeal to every person out there. The conditions in Nigeria, indeed in the new colonial world, are getting worse day in and worse and day out.
Absolutely, yeah.
When you just oppose this to the alternative coin of a Trump coming to power and the huge threats that immigrants, will have to be. Trump has said that he will use the military. But let's use this podcast as an opportunity to say that it is the policies of governments of the US, of Western powers, through their financial institutions, through the IFS, International Financial Institute of the IMF and World Bank, which are properties they benefit from, that are imposing policies in the neo-colonial world that are leaving people with no other choice to emigrate, in their hundreds of thousands out of Africa, out of Asia, out of the neo-colonial world, to come to Europe, to come to US. So we must point out that the Trump regime cannot eat his cake and have it. They cannot, through the IMF and the World Bank, be imposing policies of deregulation and privatizations on governments in Africa. And at the same time, when the working masses in those countries begin to react by seeking to move out, they are putting in place policy programs that will prevent them from staying.
Yeah, well, it just shows the utter bankruptcy of capitalism, doesn't it? I mean, one of the things that I really wanted to ask you as well is how did Nigeria end up becoming the way that it is today? Because we were speaking a little bit last night. You can, I suppose one way you can answer it is you can talk about the Tinubu regime. Okay, well, that in of itself is a valid answer. You can go further back. You can go back to the 80s. You can go way back. Yeah. And initially, you have to talk about colonialism. You have to talk about imperialism.
Slavery.
Yeah. That's the fundamental roots. If you're going to trace it all the way back, aren't you?
Well, we want to tell everybody listening to us there, because this podcast cannot go on forever. The Walter Rodney classic. There are two classics that needs to be mentioned: Eric Williams, Slavery, and Capitalism. Then there's Walter Rodney, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Two classic materials that lays the foundation of the contribution of the slave trade, of the European slave trade. European apologists would prefer to call it the African slave trade or the Atlantic slave trade. In reality, it is the European
transatlantic.
It is the European slave trade, a period where Africans, running to hundreds of thousands. Walter Rodney gives a figure of close to 20 million. This is outside the numbers of people that died during the Atlantic, during the transatlantic.
And it's not something you're taught about, really, is it? I mean, you are taught that the slave trade was a thing, but what you're not taught is without the slave trade, there'd be no British capitalism today.
Yeah, exactly.
There'd be no British ruling class today. Marx explained this, didn't he?
The horrors of the European slave trade are still with us today. How do you imagine that somebody comes to Africa, gets slaves, disease breaks out, he rather chooses to throw all of them into the sea and return back to London to catch insurance over this person. These are the types of horrors. But like you've pointed out, this is the very foundation on which capitalism was built upon. The appropriation of free labor, without having to pay people. When you hear the word slavery wage or wage labor or slavery wage, this is where that word comes from. But in reality, slavery was not a slavery wage labor. It was labor that runs up to a situation where you practically don't earn anything, which allows the slave owners and the plantations owners to accumulate capital. Of course, like we know, it was this capital that was invested, to build to push the scientific revolution, for the establishment of industries. But again, capitalism didn't stop at that. It got to a stage where colonialism, imperialism emerged on the stage. Again, too, let's recommend to people here Lenin's classic titled "Imperialism," the highest stage of capitalism.
Yeah.
A beautiful point of reference as to how these events have developed up to this stage. This is the background on which the series of nation states in Africa and indeed in the old colonial world were established. What was colonialism itself? Colonialism was an attempt by European capitalism to seek for a cheap source of raw material and to ensure that those raw materials were as cheap as possible. They came in with the Mazin and Gatling guns, the highest development of weaponry at that material moment in time. To subjugate the entirety of African states, so that they can freely cut away those raw materials without having to pay it. Of course, flag independence came, but the coming of flag independence in 1958, what Macmillan referred to as the wind of change, practically didn't change anything because the colonial structure of subjugation continued, and which is why capitalism will not and cannot develop any part of the African continent. Because for Nigeria or any part of Africa to industrialize, it must be willing to use its own resources. And when we use the word the state now, we do not refer to the existing bourgeois state that is merely a property of members of the billionaire club. The only type of state we refer to in this context must be a state of the mass of the working people themselves. Only that type of government will put the interests of the mass of workers, the millions of peasants on the African continent, the millions of mass working class youths who are trooping out, who feel that Africa, is no longer safe for them to live. But yet, Africa is one continent with huge abundant, not just human resources, abundant mineral and natural resources of all variants. Oil, gold, diamond, basinot, you name them. Abundant. Rubber, cocoa, oil. Indeed, just Nigeria alone, going by its own oil resources, if democratically managed, can take care of everybody, not just in Nigeria, in the whole of the West African region. And I'm just referring to just a singular resources. But capitalism says that all of these resources are merely for exploitation, for both local and foreign capital, to reap, to explore, to exploit and reap billions into the hands of private pockets. We must counter this. And this is why, interestingly, people like Daniel and those protesters that have been arrested have been prosecuted. Who is Daniel Akande? He is a socialist who put forward the idea that the mass of the working people must get organized. Must independently put in place a political party that will defend their interests. And within the framework of that political party, organize themselves politically to take on political power. Comrade Daniel affirms and stands for the idea that Nigeria can work, Africa can work, if the mass of the working people get organized on the basis of their strength, on the basis of their numbers, and reorganize society along the ideas that seek to use the wealth of the African continent to develop Africa appropriately.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what you've been saying there really brings me on to my final question. And I think, it's, I suppose, getting quite late here at the World Congress, so we can maybe draw it to a close with a final question. I've really enjoyed hearing your answers and hearing more about the situation in Nigeria, and I think all of our listeners will as well. I suppose the last question, which you are already touching on, Dagger, is, what is Movement for a Socialist Alternative proposing as the next steps then within the End Bad Governance protests? And how can the situation facing working people in Nigeria and across Africa ultimately be resolved in our view?
Well, I think the place to begin is that we must not sow any illusion to think that those who caused the August protests and the October 1 protests, now have the strength to think they can provide leadership to the entirety of the millions of the mass of the working people out there. Nigeria is a country of over 240 million, if not going to 250 million currently. Members of the ruling class and the bourgeoisie ultimately will not be up to 1 million in the whole of the country. They don't even constitute 1% of the population. So we are talking of a vast country. In a sense, if you allow me, Nigeria itself is a continent of people of over 250 ethnic nationalities with over 50 distinct different languages. But unlike nationalists, we do not think that these differences is enough, to think that these are different people and that Nigeria has not worked or Africa is not working because there are various ethnic groups. We say no. The needs of human beings are mindful of the language they come from, the language they speak, where they are born, where they are live, are not different. They want to be able to access the basic necessities of life. And for food to be abundant today, agriculture must be developed. Linking agriculture with industries, the means of production must be developed. All of these things are scientific. But how is it that Nigeria, is incapable, the ruling class, from its inception, the inception of Nigeria since 1914 by the colonialists, till date, that Nigeria has refused to work. But we will be wrong to think that Nigeria does not work. Nigeria functions daily, but it functions only for a particular class. It functions successfully for the colonialists, which was why they were unwilling to leave Nigeria. And when they were to leave, they ensured that they put in place a ruling class that will not disrupt or disrupt the existing colonial dependent economic structure that they have put in place. So what this means is that Nigeria has not worked for millions of ordinary working class people all over Nigeria, not because of the language they speak. So it is socialists who must bring this clarity, to the mass of Nigerian people to commence the process of getting organized. And this is what the movement for Socialist Alternative stands for. We stand for the idea that only through a democratic socialist, the ideas of democratic socialism, that Nigeria, can be transformed. And that the class to bring that about is the mass of what? Of the working people. And within that, Comrade Daniel, commits his life continuously to building around those ideas, canvassing working class youths to join our organization so that we can continue the process of building, of canvassing the entirety of the working class, both in the trade unions, both in the informal worker sector, to see how all of us can become more organized and fuse all of us, and bet a mass political party of the mass of the working people.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, thank you so much to both of you. That's a great way to end it. Thanks so much for both of you for coming on. I mean, as I was saying earlier on, of course, all sections of ISA, International Socialist Alternative, are with you in your struggle to free Daniel, to fight back against the Tinubu regime. And see you another time. And thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much for having us. Yeah,
excellent. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Revolutionary Ideas. To hear more and make sure you don't miss an episode, make sure you subscribe. And to find out more about our World Congress, you can visit our website, which is internationalsocialist.net. You can also follow us on social media. On Facebook, we're Socialist Alternative ISA England, Wales and Scotland. On Instagram, we're socialistalternative.ews. On Twitter/X, we're Socialist Alt EWS. And last but not least, we're now on Blue Sky, where we are Socialist Alt EWS. We will be back with more episodes soon, so see you next time.